This is a follow-up to the 2 million SPM megabase video I made about a week ago. There was some confusion in the comments regarding how SPM was measured and also regarding why I see Prometheum science the way I do. But one thing I kind of noticed in reading the comments was that the people who disagreed with it either didn't really understand how Prometheum science works in space age, or were just trying to blindly apply 1.1 SPM measurement methods to space age without any regard to how space age actually functions. There was speculation as to why my base worked the way it did, and I noticed that there wasn't a single comment that was actually correct. Not a single comment was actually right about why I measure the way things the way I do. So yeah, this is a bit on me. I could have been a bit clearer in regard to how I explain things. So here we go. We're gonna go as in depth as I possibly can and cover just about everything regarding SPM measurement and hub design, etc., etc. So the first thing I'd like to note is that there isn't going to be any hard consensus on this. There's just not. SPM measurement in space age is fundamentally a lot more complicated than it was in 1.1, and I don't expect there to be a consensus even after this video. But it's worth noting that the definition that I put forth in the 2 million megabase video and the one that I'm going to be using moving forward, unless we have some giant revolution in terms of, overall hub design, is going to essentially be the same as what was stated in that video. The definition I gave in that was not a complex definition, like some people said it was. It was, in fact, the simplest possible definition I could think of, because I wanted something that was easy for anyone to understand and easy for anyone who's stepping into megabasing to be able to comprehend and apply to their own megabase without having to employ one super specific design or jump through any arbitrary hoops in order to get there. The other thing I do want to mention is that as we go through all of this, the one hard rule that is not debatable is that UPS is ultimately king at the end of the day. Everything we do is about UPS optimization, period. So if something gives us, say 10-15% more SPM or something like that, but costs 50% more UPS, then, no one who's actually megabasing is actually going to do it. Alright, so let's start from the beginning. There are 12 sciences in space age. They all function relatively similarly. Like 10 of the 12 are just pretty much straightforward. Make more bottle, throw bottle into lab, bottle is eaten, etc. There are two sciences in space age which function a bit differently from the rest. One of these is agricultural science, which has a spoilage on it, which means that the amount that you get is based on the spoil percentage. For example, if it comes in and is consumed at your lab at 80%, it will only give 80% of a full bottle's worth of science. It won't give a full 100%. So that's the first hurdle that you have to tackle. The second hurdle you have to tackle is that Prometheum, the final science that is gained only from the Prometheum fields out past the solar system edge, takes twice as long to research as the other sciences. It has a research time of 120 here, and if I click on all these, you can see every single other one is 60. All other endgame sciences are 60. Like every single one. It is only Prometheum science that goes to 120. What this means is that it's used at half the rate in a lab. So if you have, say, 100k SPM with the amount of labs you have, switching to Prometheum will cut that down to 50. If you have only enough labs to, normally support your normal SPM and not Prometheum SPM. So these are things that have to be taken into account with design consideration. So the other thing I want to talk about that I think is by far the biggest misconception that I see when people talk about space age SPM is calling research productivity infinite. While it is technically infinite, it is not practically infinite. And this is a very, very important distinction to make, because I see a lot of people acting like, oh, the Prometheum doesn't matter because, like, it's like just how long you leave your base running, it just goes, like, to the moon, etc., etc. And this isn't really true. And this isn't particularly difficult to understand, but you do actually have to think about it for a bit. So, research productivity goes up by 10% every level. It is additive with the module productivity that you put in your labs. So you have your 100 base and then another 100 from the modules. And then after that comes the research prod, which adds on more and more. And the more you get of a certain additive mod, the less each level is adding in terms of multipliers to the total. If you've played Path of Exile or any RPG or are familiar with additive versus multiplicative modifiers, this should instantly be familiar and highly recognizable. That if you get like the jump going from say 100% increased damage to 200% increased damage total is much bigger than going from 1000% to 1100%. Now, research prod levels start relatively low and they only scale at about 1.5x. So you can get quite a few number of levels in before it gets to, the relatively high numbers. What we are going to call relatively high numbers in terms of megabase is anything a billion or above. Because at a billion or above, that's when it takes like, a day or so, more than a day, in order to finish a level. And that's where the point where things really start to slow down and plateau. I've made this very, very detailed scientific chart that I spent a long time on to help you understand this concept. So here we go. So if you imagine this is percent increase, and each one of these is every 100% prod, you kind of get a rough idea of what's going on here. When you start with your base lab level, when you get your first 100% prod, you're essentially doubling your science per minute. You're going from 0 prod, aka just the original 100% baseline, to plus 100%, and that plus 100% takes you, to 200 total, which will give you essentially doubling your SPM, 100% increase. However, if you add another 100% SPM, you get 50% more, because you're going from 200 to 300, and 200 to 300 is 50% more, not doubling. And then 300 to 400, again, now you're getting 300. You're getting 33% more, 25% more, 20% more, 16.666% more, and so on. You're getting less and less gain in terms of total relative gain than you were before with each successive level. Now imagine this going, these are in terms of 100%, so imagine this to 700. You can see it gets pretty low. And then you have to remember that the line for Prometheum science cost is, y equals 1.5x. Essentially, it's something like, like that. So when you get far enough to the right, which is where we are right now on this current megabase, essentially the relative gain you get per Prometheum science versus the cost, it winds up being a very, very big difference. You're talking about like several days of, gathering Prometheum science to essentially gain what is like an effective 1% more SPM at that point. And when you do the math and compare it to other sciences, you start to realize it's a lot worth it. It's not as worth it. And this is, I think, a very, very, very important concept to understand, because it kind of incentivizes running Prometheum science for a while, and then eventually slowly shutting it down, and then cranking up your other sciences to a higher level. And this is actually something that's a relatively common sentiment I've seen amongst people who have actually megabased in Space Age, and something which people who have only megabased in 1.1 and are trying to extrapolate that obsolete knowledge into Space Age just do not comprehend at all. It's not infinite. it essentially plateaus by a certain point. If it was infinite, you would see people, that left their bases running 24/7 that were at like 20 million SPM. That just doesn't happen because the time goes up by 1.5x each time. Another easy way to visualize this is with the rice on the chessboard problem. Like saying Prometheum science is infinite is saying like you can put an infinite amount of rice on a chessboard if you put 1 grain on the first square, 2 grains on the second, etc. 4, 8, 16, 32. You don't even get halfway through the chessboard before you've put more rice on the chessboard than there is something like mass in the universe or something like that. The numbers get out of control really quickly. Now, we're not scaling at 2x between squares, but we're scaling at about 1.5x between squares, so it just slightly delays that plateau, but that plateau still does happen. And I consider this base to be at that point where we're done with Prometheum science, which is part of the reason why I highly de-emphasize it in the video, because I'm not really running Prometheum anymore. I haven't really run it for maybe like the most recent 100 hours. I only showed it in the video. It's just for demonstration purposes. I didn't. It's not actually run anymore because we've hit that plateau area. Now you may be thinking like, isn't every science additive, right? Like, isn't everything just some additive increase? Yes, but when you look at the numbers, say on something like robot speed, which is something that I talked a lot about in the video and I will always talk about because it is the most important research for megabasing because it effectively reduces the number of bots required to run a particular setup. You can see it's 65% each level. So instead of 10%, it's 65. So 6.5 times as much per level. And it also scales faster, so there's less total levels. This goes up twice as much with each successive level. If I queue these up, you will see 8, 3, 6, etc. So what this means is that in order to get to the same point where worker robot speed is only giving about 1% more speed per level, the way Prometheum science is functioning right now, we would have to be at around 6,500%, right? And that would be at the point where another 65% would only be 1% more. We're not even close to that. So worker robot speed right now is still giving a good 3-4% more per level. It's not a lot. But in terms of what it actually does for your base is a lot higher. So those are some really important concepts to keep in mind. That Prometheum science is not infinite. It's not infinite. And once you get to a certain point, it's simply just not worth running compared to other sciences. So that's a big reason why I talked about things the way I did in that video. In addition to that, Prometheum science takes an extremely high amount of UPS. So you have 16 ms of essential operational time because the game runs at 60 normally. So you have 16 ms. We're at 9 right now, running just robot speed. And yes, that does mean if I wanted to run only robot speed and nothing else, I actually could crank this base much higher. I actually could, in theory, run it at about 3 million if robot speed was the only thing that I was running. I do have that room. But I chose to cut it at about the point where the Prometheum science being run, will get us close to the limit-ish. But I didn't have to. Like, why did I do it? It's completely arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary in terms of where I cut it. I absolutely could have cut it more. And you could argue it would have made more sense for me to push the robot to 3 million if my Prometheum science is cut. But, as I said, there's not going to be a unanimous consensus in terms of this. I'm just trying to explain why I view things the way I did and also try to put forth a simple definition that everyone can understand and can easily, use to measure their own base's SPM. Okay, so the last part that is a critical part of Prometheum science that must be understood is that Prometheum Science, since it can never be made at the same rate as other bottles. Like, we make about 108,000. We consume about 108,000. I can pull this up here. And we can see right there, you can see the ones that are active, more or less. It's about 108,000 being produced per minute in terms of being produced and consumed of normal bottles. So those are the numbers. Like, if you want to like measure the SPM of a base in 3 different numbers, those are the ones to take off this one. 2 million for non-Prometheum Science, 1.75 or so million for Prometheum, and about 108k bottles. The thing is, like, no one discusses SPM in terms of 3 different numbers. Like, people just say, like, my base is at X SPM, and they are usually using a method very similar, or if not identical, to the one that I put forth in that video. So, Prometheum Science, right now, I think, with both ships running, these two right here, is something around 30,000 bottles per minute, if memory serves. It's been a little while since I've had these run. They've been, gathering dust in dry dock for a little while now. But it's something around 30,000 bottles per minute. So roughly around a quarter to a third at most. And I think a third is being generous. It's really more about a quarter of the rest of your bottles are going to be Prometheum. And this is how it's going to be in everyone's base. Because Prometheum ships use a ridiculous amount of UPS. An absolutely ridiculous. If I have both these ships running, they essentially use around 4 milliseconds of update time each. So just Prometheum would use up almost half my update time in terms of what could be run. And this, I think, is something that Woo understood to a certain degree, which is why I think they made Prometheum run at half speed compared to everything else. Because, what happened there? That was random. Because they just kind of expected everyone to be like, okay, your Prometheum's going to run at half speed. It's going to run slower. So we'll let the labs run slower so you don't feel obligated to have it run at the same speed as everything else. However, the thing is, this doesn't work too well from a player perspective because you're already making just about every other science at, your maximum speed, that 100 plus K bottles per minute in my case here. So, having only half of that horsepower be used when you're running Prometheum Science feels relatively unsatisfying. But the important thing to understand regarding that is that it does mean Prometheum Science has to be buffered. Period. End of story. Like, I've seen a couple people suggest, like, oh, your Prometheum Science should be whatever you can run the ships at continuously. And this is the most asinine suggestion that I've seen anyone make. And, it's clearly being made by people who don't really have a lot of Space Age Megabase experience, because I've spoken to a lot of people, both other streamers and, non-streamer players, who are all megabasing. Like, we have a relatively active community in that regard. And pretty much nobody views it like that in terms of, having it be what you run Prometheum at continuously unbuffered. Because the way the game is set up right now, the UPS doesn't really allow for that. And you'll essentially be running your base at a much, much, much lower SPM than what you could be running at if you buffered Prometheum Science. So that's something that I know people don't like coming from 1.1, because in 1. We didn't buffer any science back then, and now here I'm saying, yeah, Prometheum is always buffered, but that's just the way it works. I didn't design Factorio. I'm just explaining how the game functions in its current state. So each of these ships brings back roughly 600,000 Prometheum Science per trip, and we buffer that in the Novice Hub, which is already very large. Now, I buffer up to about 5 million Prometheum Science at a time. And so when that's at 5 million, we're using up almost all the space in this hub. It's almost completely full. Now, there is a size limit to that hub. Like right now we're at 52,200 right now. You can see that under storage right there. Hopefully the resolution's too bad. I know that the bots tend to trash things a bit. I'm recording this video in 1440p to hopefully make it a little bit better. But that hub size has that hub storage space has a hard cap of 65535. That is a hard limit. Like, you can't bypass that limit. That is the absolute largest hub space you can possibly have. So I'm at about 5 million. And this essentially is filling up almost the entire hub right now. Now, when I switch to Prometheum Science and, it warms up through the agricultural and starts burning at the full, 1.765, whatever you want to call it, I will rip through that 5 million SPM buffer in less than an hour. Like, it goes really, really fast. So, if you want a larger buffer of Prometheum Science, you either need to store it outside the hub, which has a massive additional UPS cost, because you're now moving the bottles more times than they need to be moved. Whether it's, belting them out and storing them elsewhere. But I don't even know how you would belt it out and store it elsewhere anyway, when you have to design your hub something like this in order to be able to unload everything properly anyway. Or you would have to make extremely large cargo spaces on your ships in order to, buffer like several million Prometheum Science per ship and have it trickle down from orbit. That also has a UPS impact where the longer the ship you make, the worse it is for UPS. In fact, adding these thruster stacks had a significant additional UPS impact, in favor of increasing the SPM per ship by a decent little bit. So again, that goes back to what I was saying at the start of the video, where UPS is king, and the decisions you're going to make while designing space-age megabases are always going to be with UPS in mind above all else. So there's no real good solution. Now, I could buffer the other sciences up in space and go up to 65535 and get maybe like 10, 12 million Prometheum Science buffered in the hub, but yeah, like, the bottom line is it has to be buffered somewhere, and it's never going to be continuous, and it's never going to be like a 10-hour continuous. I know people like the 10-hour mark because that's, the next one on the production tab, because 1 hour is definitely too slow. So they like looking at that 10-hour mark to see, what the science is at. All right, so now that we've understood these core concepts, the buffering aspect, the plateauing aspect with the additive scaling, and the labs being extra and everything else, we need to talk about how this is set up and why there's a difference between my Prometheum Science and my non-Prometheum Science, or my agricultural-based science and non-agriculture, because it's not an agricultural problem, and it's not a Prometheum Science problem. It's a problem that arises at the juncture of both of these things interacting. So I've seen people say, like, oh, why don't you just get, slightly more agricultural coming in, you need to overproduce by a bit more. It's not a production issue. It's a logistical issue with how the labs are set up. And to give you the real quick TLDR of it, I got tired of flipping a switch every time I switched researches. That's actually the answer right there. It's not that I can't make more labs. It's not that I need to produce more agricultural. It's that I got tired of manually flipping a switch every single time I switched researches, because over the course of 100 hours, that gets really obnoxious, and there's no real good way to automate. So I stopped worrying about that. Okay, so in order to understand the switch, what it does, why it's there, we need to talk about the lab design now. So we have right now the hub in the middle with all the bots pulling out, and no matter how you're designing your base, your endgame lab setup is going to eventually look something like this. You can't have your bots pulling out science directly to labs, with their own little requester chests. because there's just way too many, and you only have one hub. There are 900 labs right now located in this setup, and 900 legendary biolabs. So obviously you can't have them pull out and going to the end, because that would require a crazy amount of bots. It would also require roboports within the lab columns themselves, which further spreads out the setup, which further increases the bot count, etc., etc. And again, coming back to the whole UPS is king thing, you're trying to minimize the bot count over here, period, because this is a very, very, very UPS intensive portion of the base. And there are some improvements that we're planning on making in the next run. It's just that this setup is a real pain in the butt to design once it's redesigned, once it's fully saturated. I once had to move it, and it took me like 2 hours in order to move the setup, because there's no real easy way to fully desaturate the whole thing. It's just a huge pain in the ass. So it's something we'll improve on the next run. But things like going to a 16 beacon setup, we just had this quick 14 beacon setup here that we wound up sticking with, but we do have 16 beacon layouts now that we're going to be using for the next setup and so on, and removing the trains and bringing everything, all the requester chests further in, closer to the hub, in order to further minimize bot time. But the point that I'm getting at is, no matter which way you decide to skin the cat, it's going to wind up looking something like this. It's going to be some kind of long lab columns that are being fed from one end, maybe even both ends. If you want to have trains coming in on Novice, it's probably better to have the trains feed in from the far ends, because it reduces clutter, it frees up some space around the hub and whatnot. We have our science coming out into these belts, and then it just goes right down here and straight down the column. Now, as far as the length of the columns goes, in order to find out how long the column should be, I went into the sandbox and I tested to see how many labs I could put in a row and run science through it before it stopped, it couldn't get any further down. And that number for a 14 beacon setup was something around 36 labs per row. Any more than that was a waste, because the science didn't make it any further down than that. I then took that number and I multiplied it by 0.8, because at that time I had kind of decreed that 80% or higher was a reasonable lab freshness, or lab freshness, agricultural science freshness for agricultural science to arrive from Gleba. And so the idea was that as long as the agricultural science is over 80% by the time it reaches the end, then, I mean, obviously it's lower now because we're not running it, but as long as it's over 80% by the time it reaches the end, then it will fully saturate all those labs in that column, that now 30 lab column, that 36, multiplied by about 0.8. Now, right now, these labs are obviously more than 30 per column. They are twice as long as that. They are 60 labs per column. And that comes back to the whole Prometheum science thing that I was talking about, where Prometheum science requires twice as many labs than than other sciences. You have to have them double the column if you want Prometheum science to be running close to the rate that the other sciences. I originally did want Prometheum science to be running at exactly the rate of the other sciences, but that's where the complications came in. So what happened here in the process of designing it is, we originally designed this switch right here, where these belts here can be enabled or disabled depending on whether or not we are actively running Prometheum science. Essentially, when that's what that switch does. It's buried in here somewhere. It's hard for even me to see it. It's right here. This is the Prometheum science enabler right here. So when that switch is enabled, then science is allowed to flow into the second half of the lab columns and out of the first. So when it's disabled, it's not allowed to flow past the first. So the way it's supposed to work, if you want it to function like that, is, yeah, if you're running Prometheum Science, you enable the switch. If you're not running, you disable it. And this is essentially the thing that I got tired of doing. This is actually the reason why there's that difference right now, is because I got tired of having to remember to flip the switch every time I flipped Sciences. And I don't think it's a good thing when trying to standardize a definition of SPM for the community to be like, you have to have your labs in this exact configuration, and you have to have, a control switch halfway between the labs that lets the science flow through, etc. And you have to remember to turn it off and on. The whole thing with an SPM definition is it should be simple. And like telling everybody that you must design some kind of on-off switch for the Prometheum, and you have to have that there, I don't think is healthy for communicating a standardized definition of SPM. And also, as I said, I got tired of doing it. I got tired of having to manage it, so I eventually just wound up leaving the switch on. Now, if you've been paying close attention to everything we've been talking about, you probably already understand what the problem is, or can see it pretty clearly at this point. So what happens, because we decide to just say, screw it, we're going to leave the switch on, is that when... I have night vision on right now. I feel like what planet am I on orbit about over? Just drop me. I'm not even sure if it's on or not. Feels like it's off. It is on. It's just dark. But, oops, wrong way. Endless labs look the same. So, you can probably see what the problem is that arises here. Is that by leaving the switch on all the time, when we are running non-agricultural, it doesn't flow to just the first 30 labs. It now flows a little bit past that, to like 36 or so. And you can actually see pretty clearly right now, as we're running Rooker Robot speed, you can see that happening right now. It's flowing past the halfway point and arriving at some of the extra labs. So we're essentially getting a little bonus SPM by leaving those on. And that's what actually pushes us up to the 2 million, is because on these it's using 6 more labs or so than it normally would with the science off. So in order to get Prometheum Science right now to 2 million with this setup, I would have to add about 2 more lab columns and a lot more bots. It's something like, I don't know, I had to go to like something like 16,000 bots. This is something I tried to set up a little bit off stream to try to showcase what was going on, but the amount of time it was taking to set up was getting to be kind of ridiculous, because it's not something I can really speed up very easily. And I sort of decided at a certain point, I just don't care. I mean, as I said in the main video, if you want to call my main base like a 1.76 whatever million SPM base, I don't care. I'm fine with that. But the way we're defining things is by going over the sciences that we're actually running like 80% of the time or more at this point. So this was me screwing around with that a little bit. I had to add a few more labs, and as you can see, the UPS is now significantly more tanked because of the additional number of bots here. It's using about 14,000 right now, but I had issues with it not being fully stable at that, so I kept increasing the bot number and the lab count. And as you can see, it's there's a little wobbly in there. That's caused by some other things that I just didn't care to rectify, because, as I said, I kind of spent some time on this and then quickly realized I just don't care. It's not worth the effort, because this isn't really how we're going to be doing things, either now or in the future. So yeah, but there's like a little quick glimpse. You can see like Prometheum like running at research productivity at about at closer to 2 million, and the additional cost that it requires, because the further you get away from the hub, the more bots it takes, because going from here to here is like a third of the distance going from here to here. So it essentially takes 3 times as many bots to keep this bottom column fed as this. And the thing with this, of course, is that if we switch off research productivity and just go to another science with this many labs, then now we're up to, 2.3 million in terms of how fast that's actually running. I don't think I can actually fully sustain 2.3 million long term because I think blue would eventually bottleneck. I might need to add a little more, but I'm just trying to hammer home the concept of we have these like 2 different modes that are being run here with this switch, and it's that switch and having to micromanage that switch that I decided was not really worth it. I mean, you can see you get these really, really, really big spikes when you switch from non-Promethean to Promethean because all the bottles have trickled down to the end of the labs and have fully saturated them, but obviously that won't stay saturated as it keeps running, because as it keeps running it'll eventually only make it down about here. So yeah, we get this ridiculous 4 million or so SPM spike, but that's obviously not our true SPM either. So going back to the original game, that brings us to the definition that I decided to put forth in the video. Now, as I said, I don't expect everybody to agree with this definition, and I'm perfectly willing to accept and even embrace other good definitions that people come up with if someone has a better way to define things. But if you're going to try to define a way to redo SPM in Space Age, it needs to be with Space Age in mind and not just blindly extrapolating from 1.1 and ignoring the fact that it's a completely separate game. Like, you really got to let go of that 1.1 mentality, because the thing is, most people are already more or less using the definition that I proposed. They may not have it as well defined, but they're more or less, just citing like one rough number of where most of their SPM is running. Like, very rarely do I have someone, come in chat and talk about their megabase and go like, oh yeah, I'm at like 4 million regular and like, 3 million Promethean or something like that. It's pretty much like, yeah, I'm about like X million, and we all kind of know what they mean. It's what you're running the majority of your sciences at. So to recap the definition from the megabase video, the definition that was decided upon as being a simple definition that everyone can understand and that did not take a specific setup to implement, that even a new player, someone who's relatively new to megabasing, would be able to understand and use to measure their SPM, was simply, running worker robot speed and railgun shooting speed at your maximum SPM and being able to run those infinitely, and running anything with agricultural at 80% of that SPM, so within 20%. So, if you're running at a 1 million SPM megabase and your agricultural plus is at 800,000 plus, yeah, that's 1 million. That's basically just how we're roughly doing it. As I said, I don't expect everyone to agree with this definition. I do. The SPM measurement is a lot more complicated than it is in 1.1. But the comments that I'm getting, which there aren't very many of them, but there's a handful of people who've brought it up, and a lot of these comments have been made in good faith. It's people genuinely trying to understand why we do things the way we do. But the comments where people are just like, oh, in 1.1 it was all bottles for 10 hours, so in Space Age it should be all bottles for 10 hours. That instantly goes out the window when you realize you can't even run Promethean science for 10 hours without doing some huge jumping through hoops buffering that is going to be overall worse for UPS. Whatever UPS measurement is used needs to be something where people can work on their megabase, and then once they think it's stable, they can, just check the graph and see what it's at. Obviously, you can't use just this, because I could just run mining prod, at that speed, and that's it, and that wouldn't be a really good measurement. And you can't really use just Prometheum either, because Prometheum is never run continuously. Now, I'm sure there'll be a couple people out there who are like, oh, I want to run Prometheum continuous base, and that's fine, you can do that, but it's going to run at about 500k SPM, and it's not going to ramp up higher to higher research prod levels than everyone else. You'll get slightly higher, right? If you're really doing that science like 24/7, et cetera, et cetera. But going back to the plateau thing I'm talking about, this is something that is mandatory to understand regarding the Prometheum science scaling. It's not infinite. It very heavily plateaus past a certain point, and it's important to understand that concept. But yeah, so coming back to the whole measurement thing, the part of the reason we decided to go like this is because you spend around 70-80% of your time researching not Prometheum sciences and not agriculture. And at this point, it's worth mentioning that there's no point in separating agriculture from Prometheum in terms of this conversation, because there is no infinite agricultural research that is worth pursuing. Asteroid prod essentially caps at 30. Railgun damage caps at, like 5. At that point, you're one-shotting everything at the game. Explosives has not a hard cap, but a very, very soft cap. Well, I guess very, very soft. A very hard soft cap, I should say. Actually, no, it really is kind of a hard cap at around 23, because that's the point where, yeah, it really is a hard cap. It's not a soft cap. What am I saying? It really is a hard cap, because at 23, yellow rockets one-shot big asteroids, and red rockets will two-shot them even at the edge of their splash. And to get to the point where red rockets one-shot big asteroids is unattainable due to the way the scaling works. Maybe you would leave your game running on, fucking NASA supercomputer for the next 5 years. You might hit it, kind of thing. But otherwise, it essentially is, capped. And flammables, I don't know. Flammables are just completely outclassed by Tesla turrets, once you get access to them. My fire bases have been replaced with thunder bases in this game. You can see those in the tour video, and these two caps. So once you get to actual endgame, agriculture is essentially not used for anything but Prometheum. So you can kind of think of those two together, right, so to speak. It is worth noting that if I do happen to run a just agricultural science that is not Prometheum, it is actually slightly higher than that 1.76 number, because it's not going all the way down, so it's processed at slightly higher freshness. It winds up being 1.8 or something like that. But yeah, there you go. So yeah, the issue overall is created by the combination of the double wide labs and the agri spoilage, and essentially needing a switch. And if you do wind up using that switch to its full effectiveness, you need more labs, which means more bots, which also means more pollution, which means more clearing of biters, etc., etc. And it was something that I just kind of got to the point where I was just like, this just isn't worth it. This just isn't worth it. Prometheum is essentially shut down. We are done with Prometheum. I only really care about robot speed and maybe laser damage at this point, and that's it, because those actually give tangible benefits. So those are the ones we prioritize. And the definition, I put forward essentially encompasses every science short of agricultural and Prometheum anyway. And, you can't buffer agricultural regardless. So I hope that does cover everything. I sincerely hope I'm not forgetting anything. If I am, I'll add it in the pinned comment in the description. But yeah, that's essentially where we arrived regarding defining SPM and how to measure things, is that due to that combination of those, the only way to actually do a proper separate measurement where they're both at the same thing is to incorporate some kind of switch. And having a switch that you manually have to flip every time the research switches types is not a very Factorio solution, right? If you have to be part of the factory, then it's not a factory solution. So, and as I said, over the course of the 800 or so hours I put in this game, I got tired of hitting that switch. So I was just eventually I was I'm going to leave it on and just use those extra labs to get my non-Prometheum SPM a bit higher. And as the megabase progressed, eventually kind of got to the point where it's okay, we don't really care about Prometheum anymore, so we're just running, stuff like work a robot speed 24/7 anyway. So that's essentially how the measurement came. But yeah, as I said, as with the definition put forth in the video, is you should be able to run worker robot speed or railgun shooting speed at max speed indefinitely, and that covers every bottle except agricultural, promethium, metallurgic. And metallurgic is also one of those that's it's only used for promethium science and endgame. So you could in theory buffer that too, like promethium if you want. I don't give a shit. Play how you want to play. If you were buffering metallurgic as well as promethium, and we're saying, that's a valid SPM definition, I'd be okay with that. Like I don't care. I'm not, I'm not a huge stickler over this kind of thing. I'm just trying to come up with a number, like one single number, and a way to measure that single number that generally gives you an idea of how big the base is, without being overly convoluted, without having to have ridiculous solutions where it's like, oh, you need to have a separate promethium storage area with hundreds of chests with belts that are taking things out, or bots, which is obviously way worse for UPS, or doing something ridiculous where it's like, oh, it's only what your promethium is actively coming in. Well, that doesn't make sense because you're only running promethium like 20-25% of the time anyway. Like 80% of the time you're not running promethium science. So that's how we got to the definitions that we did. And so yeah, as I said, just to hammer it home one more time, I don't expect there to be a consensus on this. I don't expect there to be. I've talked to other, megabase streamers. I've talked to Will, and like the one thing we do agree on is that it's complicated. There's no easy way to measure it. There's no silver bullet solution here in terms of, oh, this is the magic answer in terms of how we're going to measure SPM. I just tried to come up with a way that was simple, that everyone could understand, and that even a new player, or relatively new player, someone new to megabasing, I mean, not like new, right? Like, but someone new to megabasing could understand and use to measure their base. So to repeat, it's being able to run your non-agricultural sciences at your maximum speed, and then anything with agriculture to 80%. And the only specific design thing you need to do in order to be able to measure that properly, in order to hit that threshold, is make sure you build twice as many biolabs as you need, so that your promethium runs at the same speed as everything else. But to be quite honest, if someone just wanted to leave half the amount of labs and run their promethium at half speed of everything else, if someone made this exact same base and just had half the amount of labs, they never built that second column, and are just like, yeah, the promethium runs at half speed of everything else, I would still consider their base to run at, whatever they're running at 80% of the time, right? Like, if they're running, their bot speed at 80% of the time at 2 million and their promethium is running at 1 million, I'd be like, yeah, you know what, it's still 2 million, because the time you spend researching promethium is very, very low compared to the time you spend researching everything else. And the benefit you get from researching promethium once you get to around 70, 80-ish level or so, compared to researching everything else, like, really, really starts to plateau, really starts to trickle off. All right. So yeah, once again, I hope that covers everything. I'm going through my notes real quick, making sure I did actually cover everything, and I do think I did. So hopefully that explains how I see SPM right now in Space Age, and is a little enlightening in terms of how SPM actually functions in this. And just understand that, as I said, like, I'm completely open to hearing new definitions. But if your definition is it's what your promethium is being produced at continuously, that's bullshit. If your definition is you need to buffer like 10 hours of promethium science somewhere that's not the hub, and then do like one big promethium science test for SPM, I also think that definition's bullshit. So it needs to be something that consciously factors in how Space Age functions, and isn't just some 1.1 obsolete definition that's being brute forced into a completely separate game. So I hope this finally puts an end to this discussion once and for all. Because, yeah, like, it's not something that I actually even really care that much about. It's really just something that, prompted a bunch of discussion, so I thought it would be good to just, try to address that. And I was hoping this would be like a 15-minute video. Instead, it winds up being almost an hour. So yeah. Once again, I can't hit the numbers that I'm shooting for, I guess. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you even if you don't agree with the definitions that we're using, I hope you at least understood why the systems function the way they do, and why that is relatively difficult to change, or like not worth it in terms of overall UPS and overall impact to change. So thanks for watching. My name is Stupid Fat Hobbit, and I stream at Twitch TV SF Hobbit, and links in the description. Enjoy.